Welcome to Unsolved Mysteries, a podcast where we dive deep into long-forgotten cases. Today's being the case of D.B. Cooper. I'm your host, Micah, and I'm here with Joseph and Carolina. And in today's episode, we're diving deep into one of the most intriguing and mysterious unsolved cases in American history. It's a tale of daring heists, enigmatic criminals, and questions that continue to baffle investigators to this day.
On November 24th, 1971, a man known only as D.B. Cooper would board Northwest Orient Airlines Flight 305, a Boeing 727 in Portland, Oregon.
Cooper seemed like an ordinary passenger, but he was about to embark on a criminal journey that would captivate the nation. It remains the only unsolved hijacking in U.S. aviation history.
Throughout the episode, we'll be taking you through three distinct parts of Cooper's journey: the hijacking, the subsequent takeoff, and the extensive investigation. Today's episode is proudly brought to you by the one and only Waffle House, the go-to spot for delicious meals around the clock. Whether the sun is rising or the stars are out, Waffle House is there for you. Now, let me talk about their waffles. Golden perfection, crisp on the edges, and that fluffy goodness in every bite. Personally, I can't resist their pecan waffles, a true delight for the taste buds. And who can forget the iconic hash browns, smothered, covered, chunked, or peppered? The choice is yours. But it's not just about the food. Waffle House is more than a restaurant. It's an experience, whether you're catching up with friends after a night out or enjoying a family meal. Waffle House provides that warm and inviting atmosphere we all love. And there's a little something special for our podcast listeners. Mention this podcast at your local Waffle House, and who knows, you might just get a little extra love. Whether it's a bonus topping or a friendly smile from the fantastic Waffle House team.
We discussed the famous case of D.B. Cooper, a case that the FBI has referred to as one of the great unsolved mysteries in FBI history. It's also considered
the first man in U.S. history to hijack a plane for ransom. He leapt out of a commercial jet with a parachute, $200,000, and was never seen again. Dead or alive.
D.B. Cooper is a term used by the media to refer to an unidentified individual who commandeered Northwest Orient Airlines Flight 305, a Boeing 747 within U.S. airspaces on November 24th, 1971. While en route from Portland, Oregon to Seattle, Washington, the hijacker informed a flight attendant that he possessed an explosive device, demanding a ransom of $200,000. This is equivalent to $1.4 million in 2022, and requested 4 parachutes for when the plane landed in Seattle. Here's how he did it.
What was it like getting into an airport in those days?
Well, in the 60s and 70s, it wasn't really an airport, it was more of like a supermarket. So the security of the airport itself, it was basically non-existent.
Right.
There were no metal detectors, no x-rays, no police officers telling you to take off your shoes to check for bombs. It wasn't really a thing back then. And as a result, it's not that hard to believe that hijackings were pretty common back then.
Yeah, they happen all the time, right?
Yeah, there was one hijacking occurred almost every 5 days globally.
That's crazy.
However, with the booming of air travel, with its rise in popularity, officials never really wanted to downplay the dangers of hijackings because then they'd lose money. They continued to run airports without any protocols.
And Cooper also took a flight on a very popular day, so it was probably particularly unsuspicious to have someone on the airplane, right?
Yes, it was on November 24th in 1971, which was the day before Thanksgiving, which is one of the most busy days of air travel in the United States.
And he was dressed like a businessman going to visit his family for Thanksgiving. He had a full suit and tie with a black or brown business suit, a white shirt, a thin tie, a black raincoat, brown shoes, and sunglasses. He was described as a pretty normal white guy in his mid-40s, and he just bought a ticket in cash, like everyone else did in those days, with the alias D. Cooper, which later changed to D.B. Cooper. And he took a seat in the very last row of the plane and ordered bourbon and a 7-Up. He only had a briefcase and a brown paper bag with him.
So almost everyone on the flight viewed him as just a regular businessman. But shortly after takeoff, he handed a note to the stewardess, Tina Mucklow, This wasn't very uncommon for the time because flight attendants were often sexually harassed by passengers. It was probably the 10th note that Mucklow received that day, so she ignored it.
She just assumed he was hitting on her, and she didn't even care. She just kind of pocketed it. And he leans over and says, "Miss, I advise you to read that note."
Exactly, and the note said, "Miss, I have a bomb in my briefcase and want you to sit by me." So obviously this alarmed Mucklow a little bit, and she decided to listen. She sat down next to Cooper, and he opened his briefcase and showed her what was inside. There were 4 red cylinders, and they were attached to a wire and a large battery. And Mucklow assumed this to be dynamite.
So at this point, Mucklow is realizing that there is a person on this flight from Portland to Seattle who has a bomb and is threatening the safety of the entire aircraft. So she quickly communicates to the captain and the other flight attendants, and they ask Cooper his demands. He demanded $200,000 in cash at that time, which today would equal well over $1 million, and 4 parachutes, which gave them the idea that he was going to try to escape. But it's really smart that he asked for 4 parachutes because that gave them the idea that he was planning to take a hostage with him, which encouraged them to give him functional parachutes rather than ones that would lead to his death upon jumping out. He also started to make all these additional demands upon landing in Seattle. He demanded that fuel trucks must meet the plane, all the passengers have to stay seated, and Mucklow, the flight attendant who he initially talked to, has to bring the money aboard, and only then would he allow the release of the passengers. After all the passengers were released, they should bring the 4 parachutes on board. The passengers actually weren't even told about what was going on. They just said that the reason the plane was circling and landing in an area far from the gate was just because of minor mechanical difficulties, which is pretty terrifying.
At around 5:24, the captain was informed that parachutes were delivered to the airport, and he notified Cooper that they'd be landing soon. So at 5:46, Flight 305 landed at the airport.
At this point, everything was totally uncertain. Federal officials didn't actually know if this was a functional bomb. They didn't know who this guy was. They didn't know that they needed to get the $200,000 or what would happen to it. But they did deliver the bag of money. It weighed about 19 pounds and consisted of 10,000 $20 bills. The federal system was very, very intentional on the money they delivered. Most of them had serial numbers beginning with L, and they marked down all the serial numbers so that if this guy tried to spend the cash later on, they'd be able to identify him. The Seattle police also obtained the 2 front parachutes, which are reserve parachutes, from a local skydiving school, and the 2 back parachutes from a local stunt pilot.
Okay, so after landing, everyone had to listen to Cooper's demands. Otherwise, they didn't know if he was some kind of maniac who would blow up the entire plane and all.
I mean,
and kill
he's
all the
enough of a
passengers.
maniac to bring a bomb onto an airplane, so who knows?
He's enough of a maniac to build a bomb, or claim to have a bomb, not necessarily to use it. They weren't sure of anything yet. So, per his demands, only one person could approach the plane with the parachutes and the money. And everyone could only enter and exit the plane through the front door via the mobile air stairs. Because of this, the operations manager, only the operations manager, came to the plane with the parachutes and the money, and Cooper had Mucklow retrieve the money. And upon receiving it, he allowed all passengers to be released, except for 4 people: the pilot, the co-pilot, the flight engineer, and Mucklow.
Something to note is that Mucklow and Cooper had a very interesting relationship. Obviously, they had just met. She didn't know this guy at all. But she was really trying to be as charismatic as possible so that he didn't blow the entire plane up with her on board. So she handed him this cloth sack of money, and she kind of joked to him. She was like, "Oh, can I have some? Like, now that we got it for you, can I have some?" And he immediately took a stack of bills and handed it to her, and she was like, "Oh no, I can't take tips. But throughout this whole story, Mucklow and Cooper did have a little thing going on, at least for a bit. He definitely favored her over everyone else on board the aircraft.
Before we dive into our next segment, I want to take a moment to give a shout out to another one of our fantastic sponsors, the one and only Audacity. If you're into podcasting, music production, or just getting creative with audio, Audacity is the go-to software for all your editing needs. Now let me tell you why I love Audacity. First off, it's free and open source. Yes, you heard me right. Powerful audio editing without breaking the bank. It's perfect for beginners and seasoned pros alike. The user interface is intuitive, making it easy to cut, copy, paste, and tweak your audio to perfection. Whether you're editing an interview, adding in some background music, or just cleaning up your sound, Audacity has got you covered. But it's not just about functionality. Audacity has a supportive community, online forums, tutorials, and a wealth of resources. It's like having a virtual mentor guiding you through the world of audio editing. And here's the best part, Audacity is constantly evolving. Regular updates bring new features and improvements, ensuring that you will always have the latest and greatest tools at your fingertips. So whether you're a seasoned pro or just starting your podcasting journey, download Audacity today and unleash your creativity. Visit audacityteam.org to get started. A big thank you to Audacity for being an essential part of our podcasting toolkit. With the money in hand, Cooper executed a daring escape plan that involved a parachute, a deployed staircase, and a mysterious disappearance into the night sky. Unbeknownst to him, the aircraft was being trailed by fighter jets, while the crew, including flight attendant Mucklow, found themselves in a tense and baffling situation. Stick with us as we unravel the suspenseful moments leading up to the aircraft's landing in Reno, all in the enigmatic saga of D.B. Cooper.
So at this point, we're on the ground in Seattle. There's still this guy who wants to blow up the plane on board, and now he's demanding a takeoff. The plane, of course, had to be refueled. The flight was only scheduled to go from Portland to Seattle. Now we're in Seattle-Tacoma International Airport, also known as SeaTac. And there was a delay with the refueling process. So a second and third truck were brought to refuel the aircraft. Cooper was pretty annoyed by this. He was at this point saying, come on, let's get this show in the air. Let's go. And Mucklow was keeping him company. She remembers that he complained to her about the money being delivered in a cloth bag instead of a knapsack, like he asked, which made them a little bit suspicious about how he was going to transport the money, and he was later seen using a pocket knife to cut one of the reserve parachutes and use it to make a knapsack for the money.
So before takeoff, after he received the money in the parachutes, he gave the pilot some very technical parameters to abide by. And this gave rise to the idea that he was a lot smarter than your average criminal. For example, he told the pilot to direct the plane to Mexico City at approximately 100 knots, which is about 115 miles per hour, which is a lot slower than the normal plane speed. And he ordered it to be flown at a maximum of 10,000 feet altitude, which the pilots didn't even know was possible. Furthermore, Cooper also specified that the landing gear must remain deployed on the plane, and that the wing flaps must be lowered 15 degrees, and the cabin must remain unpressurized. So he gave a bunch of technical demands that not your average criminal would be able to know about.
This also suggested that he was planning to make an escape from the plane. He was planning to survive the jump out. It also is worth noting that he wanted to fly to Mexico City, possibly because the international nature of that flight would impede investigations and would make his chance of escape greater. However, they didn't actually end up going to Mexico City because the aircraft needed to refuel in Reno. Boeing 727s don't have a huge fuel capacity. They're not usually made for international flights. Cooper reluctantly agreed to this. It was clear that this contrasted some of the plans that he had earlier come up with. The aircraft range was only 1,000 miles, so going much further than Reno wasn't possible, so they finally agreed on the Reno-Tahoe International Airport as a refueling stop. Cooper didn't know about this, but the aircraft was followed by 2 F-106 fighters and a Lockheed T-33 trainer. SeaTac is right next to Joint Base Lewis McChord, JBLM, which is a huge Army and Air Force base, so they were immediately alerted of the security concern, and they did follow the aircraft. However, by now, it was 7:40 p.m. when Flight 305 took back off, so it was dark enough that seeing this guy dressed in all black if he jumped out of the aircraft was not quite possible. So Cooper asked Mucklow to return to the cabin, and Mucklow and Cooper were the only ones together in the body of the aircraft. So she was the one to see him last, and they were having conversations, and she expressed a lot of fear about getting sucked out of the aircraft as he tried to jump out, and he was trying to reassure her, and she was saying, no, please give me rope to tie myself down so I don't get sucked out. He finally goes, no, it's okay, stay safe, go inside the cabin, close the curtain, and don't come back out. So that was the last time that anyone saw Cooper. As she was going into the cabin, she begs Cooper, take the bomb with you, disarm it. He said, of course, I'll take it with me or disarm it, which is super cute, kind of couple goals.
So after Mucklow made it to the cabin, no one ever saw Cooper again, but there are a few series of events that can hint towards what happened to him. So at 8 p.m., the crew received a warning signal that indicated that the aft stairs had been opened, and the pilot used the intercom to ask Cooper if he needed any help, and Cooper angrily replied no. So then the next event happened at 8:13 p.m. when the tail of the aircraft pitched upward, and the crew ended up trimming to return to level flight. This is where investigators think Cooper most likely jumped, and the pilot states that this happened somewhere near Portland.
And they later investigated this, where they recreated the flight, and they were able to recreate that same upwards pitch motion by someone jumping out of the back. So this is usually assumed to be the time that Cooper was assumed to leave the aircraft.
So the next thing that happened was at 11:02, Flight 305 landed at Reno Airport, and the aft staircase was still extended, and the location of Cooper was completely unknown to anyone.
There are two main possibilities for what happened. He either got away or he crashed in the woods, and given that he jumped into the pitch black night in the Pacific Northwest cold, the chances are grim. Although there were over 1,000 suspects, we'll focus on the most likely one, Robert Rackstraw.
There's two main possibilities for what could have happened to D.B. Cooper. Either he got away or he crashed in the woods and died. And given that he jumped into the pitch black cold in the Pacific Northwest, his chances of survival aren't looking too good.
So after the plane landed, the FBI embarked on an investigation that lasted about 45 years.
And this actually is the only case of air hijacking in history that has not been solved.
So this led to a wild goose chase where the FBI received thousands and thousands of leads and had thousands and thousands of suspects. One of the main suspects, as we'll talk about now, was Robert Rackstraw.
Robert was one of the suspects that many people who still follow the case and who are active in those subreddits, they think he did it, because there's a lot of things about Robert that make it very likely. Bob always took a briefcase with him. He had a toupee and mustache in the briefcase. He was a bit of a guy who loved to lie and manipulate. He was super talented and very cold-blooded, kind of a cruel person.
A lot of the skills he got was from his past as a veteran pilot from Vietnam. He was in the military. He was a thrill seeker, often referred to as gutsy by those who knew him. He was disciplined for domestic violence, and he falsified many military records. He was eventually discharged from the military, and he wrote, "I would hate to use the talents the military gave me, because I would be quite an adversary." He wrote that in 1971.
And he was generally a guy who had a lot of strange things going on in his family. He was a bit of a con man in the 70s, and he actually did end up in solitary confinement for the D.B. Cooper case because the FBI truly believed it was him. He had the training, he had the capability, and most importantly, he had the troublemaker attitude to pull it off. He was also a big thrill seeker. He loved acting like he was rich. He loved doing things as a rich person. He falsified tons of military records in Vietnam. So we say all these things, and they're really starting to add up. This is the guy who would want to parachute out of an airplane after stealing a ton of money.
However, there were really two main reasons why the FBI and a lot of America just gave up on thinking of Robert Rackstraw as D.B. Cooper. With the main reason, the reason the FBI got rid of him as a suspect was because, supposedly, the CIA told them to stop looking into it. So, more background on that. Robert Rackstraw, while he was a fighter pilot in Vietnam, he had relations with some of the CIA personnel as a black ops man. In 1970, he met a CIA officer, and they had a good relationship. They became friends. And then he continued to work with them. Like in 1985, he went to Nicaragua and fought against the Contras with the CIA. After the FBI started becoming very suspicious of Rackstraw as D.B. Cooper, the CIA told them not to prosecute him because he would tell them stories that could not be told to the rest of America.
So this is what makes this case super suspicious, because they had a guy who everyone thought was him. Everything adds up. The only thing that kind of disproved his case is that Tina Mucklow said it didn't look like him, but eyewitnesses aren't super accurate. At best, 50% accurate investigation. It's very easy to forget what someone looks like. Also, the investigation had a ton of issues on the legal side. So D.B. Cooper smoked 8 cigarette butts on the plane. They had a ton of his DNA evidence on these cigarette butts, But
for some reason, the FBI had lost the cigarette butts, and that could have been vital to the case. That could have proven everything. It could have solved the one unsolved case.
they also lost the DNA samples that they found. They found hair samples and then DNA samples from a tie clip. It wasn't known if it was his, but those DNA samples also mysteriously disappeared while under the FBI's handling. It's worth noting that this case, again, did last over 4 decades, so things in the FBI do get misplaced, but the fact that all of these items of evidence for this guy who was super, super likely to be D.B. Cooper magically disappeared under the FBI's guidance.
So besides the main suspects that the FBI had, and a lot of America had, there was one other theory that came to prominence, and this is commonly referred to as the comic book theory. In the 1960s and 70s, there was this popular French-Canadian comic book written by Albert Weinberg, and the main character of this series was Dan Cooper. He was a French-Canadian Royal Air Force test pilot. He was an avid skydiver, and many seem to think that D.B. Cooper brought this character to life.
The only lead that really ever happened in this case was the discovering of money on the Columbia River. So a small 8-year-old was camping with his family, and he actually found a wad of cash that was kind of buried in the sand. And of course, this was reported, and the FBI did find that the serial numbers of the money matched up with what was found. But there's a lot of things that didn't add up. Like, why did this one stack of money come loose and was found in exactly the same order as it was given to him, but all the other stacks of money stayed together? This was very confusing, and it did lead a lot of people to think that D.B. Cooper may have crashed and intentionally planted the money because it was determined that it couldn't have been there by river deposition. It was too far from the riverbank. But since then, Mount St. Helens erupted in Washington and destroyed any other physical evidence that could have been found. So we've had no other leads on D.B. Cooper besides the comic book theory and the Robert Ragstar witness. This case remains a total mystery and also a very popular folktale in the Pacific Northwest.
This episode and all our other episodes can be found wherever you get your podcasts. You can subscribe to our YouTube channel and join our newsletter through the website at unsolvedmysteries.org. Until next week, this was Unsolved Mysteries, the podcast. I'm your host, Micah Tobler, and as we always say, don't do crime.